Live from the Lincoln Theater at the University of Hartford, the Hartford Courant and Fox Connecticut present a debate featuring the Republican candidates for Connecticut's open U.S. Senate seat. Now, here's our moderator, Fox Connecticut news anchor, Brent Hardin.
Peter Schiff, Linda McMahon, Rob Simmons. Which of these candidates will be the Republican nominee for U.S. Senate in Connecticut's 2010 election? In the next hour, we'll hear from all three as the Hartford Courant and Fox Connecticut, in partnership with the University of Hartford, present Senate 2010, a live debate from the Lincoln Theater on the University of Hartford campus. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brent Hardin of Fox Connecticut, and I'll be your moderator for the evening. At this same time and in this same place last night, my colleague at the Hartford Courant, Tom Condon, moderated a debate with the Democratic candidates. Tonight, it's the Republicans' turn. But before we begin, let me introduce to you our hosts for the evening. First, the president of the University of Hartford, Walter Harrison. Mr. Harrison.
Thank you, Brent, and welcome to the University of Hartford. The University of Hartford is a private university with a public purpose, and so we are pleased to be partnering with the Hartford Courant and Fox Connecticut to present tonight's debate. We believe that the best public policy is determined by vigorous discussion and debate. It's been a pleasure to work with Rich Graziano and his colleagues, and we thank you.
I am happy to call boss, publisher, president, and CEO of the Courant and Fox Connecticut, Rich Graziano. Rich.
Good evening. Thank you, Brent. Well, we at CT1 Media, the Hartford Courant and Fox Connecticut, are very excited and proud to be hosting and broadcasting this very special political event. I'd like to thank Carolyn Lumsden, Steve Farber, everyone at our CT1 Media team for working so hard to put this together, as well as thanking Walt and his entire team here at the University of Hartford for being such great hosts and great partners. Thank you for watching, and good luck to the candidates.
All right, thank you, Rich. Now, here are your candidates in alphabetical order. Linda McMahon is the former CEO of WWE, a global company she started with her husband nearly 30 years ago, and that today employs more than 500 Connecticut workers. Peter Schiff is a successful businessman, best-selling author, and economic expert, widely credited with foretelling the U.S. economic crisis years before it occurred. And Rob Simmons is a Vietnam veteran, a former CIA officer, and a former U.S. congressman from Connecticut. Our thanks to all three of you for joining us here tonight. Now, each of the candidates will answer two questions on three subjects: the economy, health care, and foreign policy. Each will have 1 minute to respond and then 1 minute to rebut. Our timekeepers are from the League of Women Voters tonight. They will cue the candidates when their time is short and when their time is up, with yellow and red cards, respectively. At the end, each candidate will make a short closing statement, and by a draw of cards earlier today, Mr. Simmons will answer the first question first. Ms. McMahon will give the first closing statement. And so we begin with Mr. Simmons. The first question is on the economy. The economy shows signs of crawling out of the recession with 2 straight quarters of economic growth in 2009. Yet job growth is slow, and many are predicting a double-dip housing slump. What's your plan for repairing the economy, and would you support a second stimulus bill, Mr. Simmons?
Well, first of all, I can tell you what I wouldn't do. I would not recommend lawsuits as a way to create jobs. What I would recommend is that we go to the fundamental value that all Americans have, which is free enterprise, and in particular that we focus on small business. My plan for prosperity has 5 points: taxes, access to capital, reducing the cost of health care, reducing the cost of tort claims, and streamlining training. But within that plan, we do not have legislation or proposals like the TARP or like the stimulus package or any of these other bailouts, which I believe do not work. We have to focus on the fundamental engine of our economy, which is small business and free enterprise.
All right, Mr. Simmons, thank you. Mr. Schiff, same question.
Well, first of all, Washington is trying to convince us that we're having a jobless recovery. They're half right. The reason that it's jobless is because it's not a recovery. All we're doing is spending more borrowed money, and that's the source of our problem. You see, we have to make a decision as a nation. Do we want to grow the government or grow the economy? Because we can't do both. The stimulus is not the answer. The stimulus is part of the problem. It's actually a depressant. The government has been growing like a cancer, and the bigger the government gets, the more blood it actually sucks from the taxpayer to sustain it. We need real economic reform to unleash capitalism and free markets, and that means we have to slash government spending right now, we have to lower taxes, and we have to reduce the regulations that are burdening business and destroying jobs.
All right, Mr. Schiff, thank you. And Ms. McMahon.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for the folks who are here tonight, our hosts for this debate, and our folks who've welcomed us into their home tonight. We do have to get our folks back to work, because this economy is not sustainable unless people get back to work, unless they have jobs. And small businesses do create 70% of the jobs in this country. We have to incentivize them through tax breaks, through tax credits, through reducing payroll tax. I've traveled around the state. I talked to a small business owner, and I asked him, what is the most important thing we could do for you to help you recover? And he said, reduce my payroll tax. I could add another person. I could take on another job. And I could then grow my business again. But I also need to have credit from my bank. Used to I could get a bridge loan. Now I can't. So we have to free up those credit markets for our small businesses.
All right. Now, Mr. Simmons, back to you. 1 minute to rebut.
I think it's very important when we discuss this issue that we do focus on the damage that has been done, I would argue damage that has been done to our economy by legislation like TARP. I opposed TARP. I didn't think TARP was a good idea. Many economists opposed it at the time. I believe that Mrs. McMahon has expressed support for it. But all I see coming out of a legislation like TARP is the taxpayer footing the bill for executive bonuses, executive compensation, executive country club fees, and a whole range of things that we did not comprise when that legislation was first proposed. I think it's been a mistake. I think we could have done a much better job with private sector lending backstopped by government resources.
All right, Mr. Schiff, over to you.
Sure, I opposed TARP as well. I opposed it on national television when everybody told us that we needed it. We're not going to solve these problems until we understand the nature of the problem. See, the country's in trouble because we spent too much money. Individuals spent too much money. We went on a global shopping spree with government money. We bought all sorts of things we couldn't afford. Now the government is spending money on programs we don't need and we can't afford. In order to get out of this hole, we're going to have to work our way out and produce our way out. We can't spend our way to prosperity. We can't borrow our way out of debt. We need capital. We need investments. And all of this is being inhibited by the stimulus and by the TARPs. We need to embrace free market capitalism. That was the source of our original prosperity, and it's the only way we're going to regain it.
And Ms. McMahon.
Thank you. I just want to make one thing clear, though, relative to TARP. From my standpoint, as Rob had indicated that I supported it, I did support TARP in its original form. I would not have supported AIG bailouts or auto bailouts, but the original form of TARP was as our economy was melting down and our banks were going to get money to take toxic assets off their books, they would pay back those loans with interest, and that money would then be used to pay down the debt. That is what I supported, and Congress has the ability today to take the balance of TARP money and pay down the debt, and I think that's what we should do. I agree that we have to stop job-killing legislation like card check, like cap and trade, and we have to create a feeling of stability and a culture of stability for our businesses so that they can feel free to borrow, that they don't have to worry about what taxes are coming down on top of them, if health care is going to be put on top of them at this particular point. So they are in a period of instability, and it doesn't make them want to grow and take risk.
All right. Thank you, candidates. On to the second question on the economy. This comes from one of our viewers, Jim McLaren, who did not indicate the town he lives in. Very simply, his question, what specific changes would you advocate as a senator to stimulate job creation? I believe we were just talking about that. Mr. Simmons, you answer first again.
Referring back to my plan for prosperity, the 5-point plan, I would focus very specifically on taxes. First of all, the Bush tax cuts of 2001, 2003, they're scheduled to expire. If they expire, they will create a very large tax increase for the American people and for business. That's wrong. I recommend a 40% payroll tax cut as an incentive to business to keep jobs and maybe even create jobs. Expensing equipment has worked out very well. I would make the $250,000 expensing for equipment permanent. Death taxes are death to families that own farms and small businesses. We need to reduce death taxes. Access to capital is important. Working through the SBA, we've got to get the loans to the banks to make some more loans. And we certainly have to reduce health care costs, which I'll talk about later.
All right, Mr. Simmons, Mr. Schiff, how to create jobs?
Well, first we have to understand where jobs come from. They come from private enterprise. They come from profits. They come from savings. They come from investment. They don't come from government. Government inhibits job creation. We can't create jobs by passing legislation. We can certainly destroy jobs. We have to remember that the government doesn't have any resources. The government only has the resources that they take from the private sector. And it's very easy for our elected leaders to point to a job that they claim was created by the stimulus. But they don't accept responsibility for the better jobs that the stimulus money destroyed. Because the government had to take that money from one company in order to feed it to another company that maybe should have failed, or maybe is a government job. And the problem with government jobs is we have to pay their salaries. Private sector jobs are self-sustaining, and they actually produce things that increase the standard of living of everybody. So we need more private sector jobs, and to get them, we need a lot less government, we need less regulations and lower taxes, and we can't do that unless we cut spending.
All right, Ms. McMahon.
Well, I think you'd hear a lot of agreement among the three of us here on the stage, because we really do understand about jobs and about small businesses and how they are the engine of this economy. And I think we all share a lot of the same programs in terms of bringing those taxes down and creating the environment that these small businesses can grow. I've created 500 jobs here in Connecticut. I've grown my business here. I know that it takes a great deal of confidence in the marketplace before you take that risk of adding people or taking on that next project. You have to have confidence in the credit system that can see you through in tough times. And when government regulations and mandates are coming down on top of you that are unfunded and required, it puts you in a very bad spot to make your business grow and be better. If you create jobs, those people pay income tax, they buy more goods and services, they add to the economy. So that's what we have to do, is stimulate the economy with jobs.
All right, and Mr. Simmons, back to you, one more minute on job creation.
I served for 22 months as the first business advocate for the state of Connecticut, and I had the opportunity in that capacity to visit 400 businesses throughout the state, one a day, every day. And what I learned in that process was several things. First and foremost, small business in Connecticut is big. Small business in America is big. Small business in Connecticut is responsible for most of our job creation, and across the nation, 70% of all jobs are created by small business. 97% of all businesses in America today are less than 20 employees, and that's why my plan for prosperity focuses on them. And what do they tell me? Taxes are too high. Tort claims and litigation are eating them up. The litigious society in which we live is troublesome. They can't afford health care. So these issues are important, and this is one reason why I signed the pledge put out by the Americans for Tax Reform, a pledge that if elected to the Senate, I would not vote to raise taxes, and I would, of course, encourage all my colleagues to do the same.
All right, Mr. Schiff. 1 minute for rebuttal on job creation.
Well, again, we have to understand where jobs come from. You know, politicians like to promise that they can create jobs because it sounds good. They like to have summits on how to create jobs. Meanwhile, everything that they're doing is preventing jobs from being created. That's why almost 10% of the nation is unemployed. It's actually more like 17% if you count the people who are underemployed working part-time or who have just given up and are now discouraged. So what the government has to do is understand all the roadblocks that it puts in front of employers that prevent them from hiring people, roadblocks that I've experienced in my own business. We need to make it easier for businesses to expand and grow. We need to lift the burden of government. That's the only real stimulus that we have, is by shrinking government. but with all the money the government is spending, and more important, all the money the government is borrowing. If you want to know why businesses aren't loaning, they're loaning. The problem is they're loaning it all to the federal government. There's nothing left for anybody else. So until we stop the spending, we're not going to get economic growth, and we're not going to get job creation.
All right, and Ms. McMahon.
Robert indicated that he was the business advocate in Connecticut. You know, I just have to say, as growing a company and being the CEO of a company, until you've had to make a payroll, until you've had to balance a budget in that company, until you have your own capital at risk, you can't stand in the shoes of that small business owner and know what he's going through. The fear that he has. If it's just 2 or 3 guys. I was in a deli the other day, and when the owner of that deli was telling me, you know, if this bill goes through where I'm going to have to provide benefits for part-time workers, he said, I'll have to go out of business. I can't work anymore myself. So until you've stood in those shoes and understood what small businesses go through, when they go to get a loan, what kind of collateral they have to post. They form good relationships with their community bank, but the regulations now are so hard and so tight on the community banks that they're not lending to small businesses because they're afraid. So we have to free up some of these credit markets and let these small businesses be able to grow.
All right, so we move on now to our second category, and that's foreign policy. On the foreign policy questions, Mr. Schiff will answer first, followed by Ms. McMahon, and then Mr. Simmons. So our first foreign policy question. American soldiers have been engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan for most of the last decade. They are fighting valiantly, but battle-weary and stretched thin, as is, frankly, the American public. Yet many, if not most of us, are convinced Iran is trying to disguise a nuclear weapons development program as a nuclear power program. Given Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's recent comment that Iran is moving toward a military dictatorship, what's your plan for dealing with Iran, and would a military strike be necessary or advisable?
Well, first of all, obviously Iran is a serious threat. They have supported terrorism, and we need to make sure that they don't become a nuclear threat. So if I was a member of the United States Senate, I would certainly do whatever I could to make sure that that did not happen. It would involve diplomacy first, but ultimately if that failed, it would involve a military action. But I don't believe we should make the same mistakes in Iran that we made in Iraq. I don't believe that we need to invade the country and occupy the country and try to rebuild it. If there is a legitimate nuclear threat and we can identify that, let's neutralize that threat. But let's not commit our troops to an endless war that becomes a costly quagmire that we can't afford at this point.
All right, Ms. McMahon, you're next.
Iran is a rogue nation. Ahmadinejad has indicated that he hates all things Western. I think he'd like to blow us all up. He'd certainly like to take Israel out. And we have to support Israel. Israel is a strong ally of ours. But let's make no mistake about it. They're enriching uranium as we sit here. And it's not for peaceful purposes as far as I'm concerned. They're looking for military warheads. We cannot let them have it. So we must utilize, I agree, diplomacy. I think our sanctions have to be strong, but so far they've thumbed their nose. We have to continue to forge coalition with our allies. We have most of our allies on board now, but China is still reluctant to come on board because they depend on a lot of oil from Iran. Russia's indicated some willingness. But we have our other allies, and we're going to have to be strong with these sanctions, and that's what we have to do first. But we cannot take any action off the table, and that includes military.
All right, Ms. McMahon, thank you. And Mr. Simmons.
You mentioned Afghanistan, and I would say first and foremost, I would object to the administration policy of setting deadlines for our troops in Afghanistan. As somebody who has served in war, as somebody who's spent over 30 years of my life in the military, whenever the administration or the Congress sets deadlines for completion of an action, that puts the soldiers and their families under tremendous stress. Dealing with Afghanistan, I would say the surge there is going to have a marginal effect. That what we really have to do in Afghanistan is focus on the tribal leaders who have an almost 2,000-year history of managing their remote parts of the country. And the best way to deal with them is through special operations forces and with CIA operatives. I've done some of that work myself. It's difficult, it's dangerous, but it will be effective. With regard to Iran, I'll save my comments for rebuttal.
All right, and we are at the rebuttal phase then. Mr. Schiff, back to you.
Well, obviously, as I said, Iran is a threat, and I think we have to guard against that threat. But we have to be careful with our military policy. Remember, the reason that we went into Afghanistan initially was we were going to get Osama bin Laden, which certainly made a lot of sense, given what he did. But he's not even there anymore, and we're committing more troops. We have to have real plans before we go into a nation. I thought it was a mistake at the time, and I still think that we shouldn't have gone into Iraq. And so we have to run our foreign policy to protect America and American interests, and we can't get into nation building and try to involve ourselves in too many places around the world. We have troops in 150 or 160 countries. We have a lot of military bases. We need to focus on defending the United States, especially since we're broke at this point, and we can't keep charging our national defense on a credit card and expect that it's not going to come back to bite us. All right, Mr. Schiff and Ms. McMahon.
I think the first job of a government, the first responsibility of government is the safety of its citizens. And that is what we must focus on. I do think that we should take the fight to terrorists outside of the United States. We don't want them coming here. Afghanistan has proven to be a launching pad for terrorists, and I'm glad we're taking the war there to them. We need to arm those men and women who are there, have a strategic plan, not indicate when we're leaving, and then work with those leaders of that state, of that country, to let them know that we're supportive. We're there. We're not just going to leave. We're going to help them because they don't have any place else to turn if we just go and leave. However, back to Iran for a second, I do think that when the last election was held in Iran and we saw the unrest, we don't believe that it was a fair election, and there is a regime there that wants to take over the government. We need to help support that regime so that we can have that changeover, because that's how we'll get effective change in Iran, because it's such a rogue nation.
All right. And Mr. Simmons, your opportunity to pick up where you left off.
Briefly, with regard to Afghanistan, back in the 1980s, we provided material support to the Mujahideen through Pakistan, which eventually resulted in the defeat of the Soviet Union in that country. But having accomplished that, we walked away from Afghanistan, which made it a base for al-Qaeda. I would argue that we do have an interest in Afghanistan, and the interest is to keep it from becoming a base again. But I would also argue that that does not necessarily mean a large commitment of U.S. forces, but it does involve special forces. With regard to Iran, I spent some years of my life doing nuclear nonproliferation work in Asia. Iran is a theocracy. They don't care about the sanctions. We can try them. We can do the toughest sanctions we can think about. We can work with China. We can work with Russia. But the fact of the matter is that at some point the American people are going to have to decide whether military action is acceptable, either with us or with other countries, with Israel or other collections of countries around the world. We cannot allow that country to become a nuclear power.
Okay, and that brings us to our second question on foreign policy. This was emailed to us from Harold Garagosian of New Britain. And Harold, I hope I have that correct. And we're going to stay with Iraq and Afghanistan. His simple question: when should American troops be withdrawn from Iraq and Afghanistan? And Mr. Schiff, it's your answer.
Well, as I said, I was against bringing them to Iraq in the first place. I certainly think we should have some type of timetable to bring them out, but I don't know exactly what that timetable should be. I think the same thing is true for Afghanistan. I think we have to have a mission, and I think we need to have some way to be victorious and a way to get out of there and maybe leave a small presence, but we don't need the troops that we have now. And I understand that national defense is the most important issue for the federal government. It's the one thing that it's supposed to really do. It's the main reason that our founding fathers gave Congress the ability to tax us in the first place. But the problem is the government is focusing on so many things that are not authorized by the Constitution that the one thing it's really supposed to do, it doesn't do right. So if we can focus more on national defense and less on all the other issues that are better left to the states or not done at all by government, I think we'd all be better off. Thank you.
All right, Ms. McMahon.
Well, there is a plan underway now for the withdrawal of troops from Iraq. And we are seeing that there is more stability in that country. I think they're coming up on their second election. However, if Iraq was to start to destabilize, I think we'd have to think about keeping our troops there so that we don't want everything we've accomplished over the last few years to go undone. So I think we have a responsibility there. But the goal is to remove our troops there and leave behind those operations that will not be involved in military action. Relative to Afghanistan, As I mentioned earlier, I do believe that we have to work with the nationals who are there so that they feel that they're going to be supported when our troops withdraw. The President, through advice of commanders, has committed another 30,000 troops to that area. They should go in with a plan for victory, and we should bring them home. And then when we bring them home, let's take care of our veterans, because they put their life on the line, they put their lives on the line for us, and they deserve the best that we have to treat them here at home.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Simmons.
The question was, when should we withdraw from Iraq and Afghanistan? And for me, the answer is simple: when we win. When we win. I spent almost 4 years of my life in Vietnam, 22 months as a soldier, 2 years as a CIA officer. And nothing was more demoralizing for me and my family than to listen to the endless debates back in Washington, D.C., in the Congress of the United States of America about what we should do here and what we should do there, and what about this and what about that, and what about this deadline and what about that deadline. We have to be firm. And Mrs. McMahon talks about supporting our veterans. There's no better way to support your veterans than to support your military when they're on active duty and welcome them home successfully when they've completed their duty. For their families and for the soldiers, this is critically important. We're doing well in Iraq. The casualties are down. We're bringing forces back. The transfer of power has been successful. We've got a little bit of ways to go in Afghanistan, but I would argue with Mr. Schiff that we need a change in policy that focuses more on special operations forces and less on conventional forces.
All right, we are on to the rebuttal phase on this same question. You each have 1 more minute to talk about when American troops should be withdrawn from Iraq and Afghanistan. Mr. Schiff.
I think one thing I'd want to add is we can't overlook the financial position of our government and our ability to continue to maintain our military. You know, even Hillary Clinton last week mentioned that she thought the budget deficits and the national debt are now a national security issue. And she ought to know, as a United States Senator, she helped run the deficits up, and now as part of the Obama administration, they're going through the roof. The Soviet Union at one time was a powerful military power, and it disintegrated because it collapsed financially. It could no longer afford the empire. We're in the same situation. We're borrowing money from China, from Japan, from Saudi Arabia to supply the troops. We can't keep doing that and remain a military power. So I think the best thing that we could do for national security is have financial security, and the only way to do that is to get this out-of-control government spending under control.
All right, and Ms. McMahon, back to you.
I'm a mother of a son and a daughter, and I can well appreciate how those mothers feel when their children go off to war. And so no mother wants to see their children go off to war, or a wife to see her husband, or a husband to see his wife now go off to war. So I think that we do want to bring our troops home. And when we bring them home, as I said, we should take care of them. I've had the opportunity at World Wrestling Entertainment to visit with some of the wounded soldiers at Walter Reed Hospital. These are the bravest young men and women I have ever talked to, and all they want to do is to get back to their unit. They just want to serve. They are the bravest young men and women you will ever want to know. We need to support them and their families. We have to take care of them and not send them into harm's way without a strategic plan for victory. But let's accomplish that goal and bring them back safe and sound.
All right, and Mr. Simmons.
I'd like to raise another issue within the context of both our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that issue goes to the question of detainees. The current administration has made a decision to bring Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to New York City for a civilian trial. The day that was announced was the day that I announced my opposition to that. I don't believe that a man who was the mastermind of killing 3,000 innocent Americans, 12 of whom were my former constituents as a member of Congress from the 2nd District, 2 of whom were close personal friends of my daughters and friends of our family, young men who died on the 105th floor of the World Trade Center. I don't believe the mastermind of that terrible event deserves a civilian trial in New York City or New Haven or anywhere else here in the continental United States. And furthermore, at a time when our economy is in difficulty, at a time when people are unemployed up to 10%, and people here in Connecticut are faced with foreclosure, I don't want one taxpayer dollar going to protect that individual for a civilian trial here in the United States of America.
All right, Mr. Simmons. Move on now to questions about health care In this round, Ms. McMahon, you will answer first, followed by Mr. Simmons and then Mr. Schiff. Our first health care question. Millions of Americans do not have health care insurance, including close to 50,000 here in Connecticut. Many Democrats are pushing for a single-payer system of health insurance to provide coverage for all Americans. But many people believe a single-payer system would adversely affect an insurance industry that employs tens of thousands of people here in Connecticut. As a senator representing us, how would you move forward on reducing health care costs and providing for the uninsured without damaging Connecticut's insurance industry? Ms. McMahon.
Well, certainly health care is on the minds and tongues of everyone these days because our president has certainly made this a priority issue. The majority of Americans have all said they want health care reform. That same majority has said they don't want Obamacare. And we don't want Obamacare for a lot of reasons. One, the way the bill came out of both the House and the Senate. It was done behind closed doors with special interests. The people of America don't have confidence in this bill. It's not going to reduce costs. It's going to raise premiums for families. It's going to cost businesses more with their taxes. It's going to penalize seniors by reducing Medicare. And, you know, we just cannot have this kind of a health care bill. We don't want anything to come between the doctor-patient relationship. We first got to take costs out of health care. We can do that by proposals that have been made. Tort reform, bringing down malpractice insurance, which will absolutely take out about $240 billion a year out of the private sector that has to pay these high costs. And we also can pool our resources and buy insurance across state lines.
All right, you've just come perilously close to answering our second question on health care, but we'll stick with this question for now. And Mr. Simmons, to you, how would you reduce costs and provide for the uninsured without damaging Connecticut's insurance industry?
I would oppose a single-payer system because that, to me, is not health insurance reform. That is essentially government-run insurance and government-run health care. I would oppose the government option, and I've opposed the government option throughout the last year, ever since it first came up. I think it's a terribly bad idea. I speak to this issue in part because as a veteran, you would think I would be eligible for government-run health care through the VA system, the Veterans Administration system. After 37 years of service and 4 years in a war zone, you would think I would be eligible. But I'm a priority 8, so I'm not eligible. What that means is the government is inefficient in providing access, inefficient in reducing costs, and does not extend full coverage to people when they are solely responsible for their care. What we need to do is address the issue of cost through eliminating defensive medicine, which costs us over $100 billion a year. Tort liability claims are eating up our resources in health care. We have to work very hard to have... I have to work very hard to slip over to the rebuttal phase. Thank you.
Okay. All right. All right, Mr. Schiff, to you.
Sure. Well, before we can solve the problems of health care, we have to understand the nature of those problems. You know, the free market is the best mechanism that we know to bring costs down. And we've all experienced that in our daily lives. We see it in cellular telephones, flat-screen TVs, laptop computers. Every year they get more complicated, more intricate, yet every year the price comes down. Why isn't that working in health care? The reason is government. Government refuses to allow free market forces to operate in health care. Some of those reasons were pointed out by my opponents. But what we need to do is we need government to remove all the roadblocks, the regulations, the mandates, the subsidies that are distorting the free market and that are preventing it from delivering the benefits of affordable health care to all Americans.
All right, Mr. Schiff, thank you. We move on to the rebuttal phase on this question. I'd like to remind the candidates that a component of the question was improving and reforming health care without damaging an industry that's very important to our state, a major employer here. So perhaps you could tailor your remarks this time around in the rebuttal phase to that phase of the question. And Ms. McMahon, it's back to you.
I've met with some of our health care providers here in the state. I've met with hospital administrators and talk to them about the cost of health care. And, you know, really, when I sit and talk to them, some things that I was not aware of were how many state mandates there are relative to insurance coverage and insurance premiums. This state, as do all states, regulate the insurance industry, and I think the state of Connecticut now has about 60 different mandates that an insurance company that's providing coverage must provide. So there's a cost to that. And if the service provided at the hospital for one of those covered things is not reimbursed to that level, healthcare picks up the difference. That's why with Medicare, when those reimbursements are reduced, then there's a bigger gap. And if we're looking to cut Medicare, insurance companies are going to have to pick up more of that cost. So I think we have to look at what the mandates are relative to insurance companies to see if there's not some room there to reduce those costs.
All right, Mr. Simmons.
Connecticut is known as the insurance capital of the world, and I would argue, given the state of our economy, given the state of our unemployment, we want to keep it that way. We want to make sure that good insurance jobs remain here in Connecticut, and especially in Hartford, where some of the big providers are located and where some very large investments have been made. But I would argue that the insurance industry could be a player in bringing about some of these cost savings. For example, I've argued that small businesses should be allowed to associate in what I call association health plans to reduce costs of health insurance by increasing the numbers that then negotiate. It would seem to me that the insurance industry would welcome this kind of business coming their way. I also believe it's important to break down the state barriers and allow individuals and entities to negotiate for their health insurance coverage across state lines. We do it for other kinds of insurance, car insurance, house insurance, fire insurance, flood insurance. Why shouldn't we be able to do it with health insurance? So I think there are a lot of good ideas where the industry can actually facilitate and do well as we move forward.
All right, thank you, Mr. Simmons. And Mr. Schiff, on to you.
Specifically, with insurance, one of the ways that the government can reintroduce market forces into the insurance industry is to stop incentivizing individuals to purchase their health insurance through their employers. It wasn't always that way. And of course, we don't get our fire insurance, our homeowners insurance, our automobile insurance through our employers. And first of all, employers don't give insurance to their workers. Workers earn insurance, and they accept insurance in lieu of the higher wages that they otherwise would have earned. I would like to fix the tax code so that individuals get the same tax breaks when they buy insurance directly as opposed to buying it through their employer. That's going to solve the portability problem. For most people, it's going to solve the pre-existing problem, and it's going to put the consumer back in charge so market forces can come to bear to control runaway insurance and health care costs.
All right, Mr. Schiff, thanks very much. All right, the next question, this is from an emailer, Don Tenerowitz of Ellington. This is a three-part question. Have you read the Senate version of the health care bill in its entirety? How would you vote on it? And what specific changes would you make to the bill, or if I might add, to health care reform legislation at all? And the first answer this time is to Ms. McMahon.
I have not read the full Senate version, nor do I doubt that many of the senators who have already voted on it have read it. Nor do I think the House members have read the bill that was passed there either. And that's part of the issue. The senators, congressmen do not have the opportunity to understand the bills that they are going to pass legislation on. So one of the things that I have said early on in this campaign was no less than a minimum of 72 hours should a bill be posted online. Now, if we want to think about that health care bill, there's probably a stack about that high. I'm not sure if you could even, I don't know how long it would take to download that to read it on your computer. But those are massive pieces of legislation. But we need to understand what it is that we're voting on. And it's back and forth, back and forth. The Senate has one bill they're trying to push through now. Now we've got this whole issue of reconciliation. It's just the wrong way to get this bill passed. It's ramming it down our throats. This is not a bipartisan effort. The system was flawed. The process was flawed for this bill, and we've got flawed legislation coming out of it.
All right, Ms. McMahon, thank you. Mr. Simmons.
I've not read the bill. I did read the Dodd bill some months ago. I was intrigued by it because it included a carve-out for members of Congress. So here was a piece of legislation being proposed by the chairman of the Banking Committee that was, in this particular case, as a member of the Health Committee, 700 pages without the amendments included that had a carve-out for members of Congress. You can be sure that that bill was no good because if it was any good, members of Congress would have wanted to be included. You don't really have to read all of these bills anymore to realize what they're all about. They're not about reform. They're about government takeover of health care, which is something that I oppose. I made it a habit as a member of the Connecticut General Assembly and as a member of Congress not to vote for any bill that I did not have time to read. I felt that that was fair and that we have a responsibility to read this legislation before voting it up or down. And that certainly is a mechanism that I would intend to use in the future.
All right, Mr. Schiff.
No, I didn't read the bill, but I don't have to read the bill to know that I oppose it. I mean, I oppose it on principle. I oppose the concept that we need more government involvement in health care. I think government involvement in health care is one of the reasons that it's so expensive right now. So we need to reverse that. You know, government is already involved in health care. Look at what happened with Medicare. You know, Medicare actually costs more than 10 times, adjusted for inflation, what they originally estimated the cost would be. And now the unfunded liabilities are in excess of $30 trillion. After such a fiscal disaster, we can't afford to turn over more of our health care to the government.
All right, and you each have 1 more minute to talk about this. I didn't hear a lot of disagreement here, but you have 1 more minute for rebuttal, and it is back to Ms. McMahon.
Well, I think we all have agreed on this stage that none of us would want government takeover of health care, and I believe that's pretty much what was incorporated in a good part of these bills. We don't want government-run health care. I don't want, the public option. I don't want a single-payer option. I agree definitely with Peter that private enterprise and the private market system is what will bring costs down. I'll just give you an example. A friend of ours who lives out in Las Vegas went to get an MRI this past week. And he went in and he wanted to know how much the MRI was, and she told him it was $1,500. He said, well, I'm sorry, but I can't pay $1,500. I don't have any insurance. Come back with your best price. They charged him $650. Now, I don't know. Maybe we all go in and bargain to see what it is we're going to get. Sounds like a plan to me, but clearly there are some costs built in that we ought to be able to bring down. Free market.
All right, Mr. Simmons.
Yes, referring once again to my plan for prosperity and addressing the issue of health care as a real problem for small business. During a period in my life, I was covered by a private plan which I had to buy. I was between jobs and I had to buy the plan. And it went up dramatically. And even though my wife and I were working 4 jobs, part-time jobs between us, me 3 and she 1, and we're making some money, none of our jobs provided health care, and yet we weren't allowed to deduct the cost of our insurance policy from our income. I think that's wrong, and I think the unfair treatment, the unfair tax treatment of health care is a real problem. Large corporations and many businesses, large businesses, can deduct those costs before taxes. Individuals and many small businesses cannot. And that inequity is another problem that I think should not be hard to solve, and that we need to address if we're really going to allow the engine of our economy, small business, to recover, prosper, and create jobs.
All right, and Mr. Schiff.
Sure, I mentioned earlier that the free market is working to bring down costs in consumer electronics. And a lot of people think, well, that doesn't work with health care. But it does. It's actually working right now with eye LASIK surgery. The procedures are constantly getting better, and they're constantly getting less expensive. And the reason is insurance doesn't cover it. Consumers pay for it out of pocket, not through their paychecks, and so they do negotiate price. They do shop around, and the doctors performing the surgery know that. Unfortunately, we have a tax code that is encouraging an overutilization of insurance. We need to have the consumer more involved. We need to have routine medical procedures picked up out of pocket, and if the government would simply lower our taxes, which they could easily do, we'd have plenty of extra money to pay for the routine medical cares, and then insurance could be low cost for the catastrophic events that we all hope don't happen, but that we really need insurance for.
All right, thanks very much. As it happens now, we have time for an extra question. So I'm going to ask one that was on the minds of many of our emailers, our viewers and readers who emailed their suggestions to us, and I'm going to put it under the umbrella of health care, but you could really put it in any of these categories. There's been a lot of talk about partisan politics and gridlock in Washington lately. If elected, what would you do to overcome those things and work with Democrats and independents to move forward on the economy and health care and other issues? And on this extra round question, we're going to go to Mr. Simmons first.
I often say that my mother's a Democrat, my wife is unaffiliated, and my 2 children, Rob and Jane, are Republicans, but I love them all. I love them all. And I think that what I'm trying to express by that is that when it comes to many issues that concern us in America today, the economy, jobs, housing, roads, bridges, national defense. There may be a Republican solution, there may be a Democrat solution, but the solution that I look for is the American solution. The American solution. In my service in the Connecticut General Assembly for 10 years, I worked with many Democrats. In my service in Congress, I worked with many Democrats on issues where we did not have to sacrifice our principles, but we could work together effectively for a common cause. I think that can be done. I've done it. I think we need to do it some more.
All right, Mr. Schiff, to you now.
You know, a lot of people say that we need bipartisanship so we can overcome the gridlock. Well, I don't want to overcome gridlock if that's the only thing standing between us and more government. You know, I want to change what's happening in Washington, and I don't want to go to Washington to compromise my positions or my principles. I want to try to persuade and educate the other members of Congress to adopt my principles, and those are the principles of smaller government, cutting spending, cutting taxes, repealing regulations, and I'm not going to compromise. If someone says, well, just raise taxes a little bit, no, we can't afford higher taxes. The country is broke, and the people can't send more money to Washington. We have to stop Washington from taking our money, and you can't do that if you're going to compromise. We've been compromising for years, and look at the mess that we're in.
All right, Ms. McMahon.
Well, I often think the gridlock that we are seeing in Washington now is caused, by career politicians who are so concerned about being reelected. If I'm your senator serving, I'm not going to worry about being reelected. I'm going there to do a job. You're hiring me for 6 years. I'm going to do the best job I can for the people of Connecticut while I'm there. I think you have to try and drive consensus. I've done that in boardrooms. I've done it sitting across negotiating tables. But when you can't drive consensus, you have to drive your point. You have to hold to it. I've been successful in winning a lot of those arguments. And the very best deal I ever struck was the one that both sides walked away from the table getting part of what they wanted, not all of it, but part of what they wanted, because those deals stuck. And if it was not a deal that had something in it for both sides without compromise of principles, then those were the deals that lasted. But if not, they fell apart. And you'd be back challenging them to see if you could redo the deal.
All right, and we're going to stay with our format here. You each have 1 more minute.
As I suggested in my previous comment, one can achieve consensus without sacrificing core values. And I think there are some practical examples of where we can show that. I have a core value that it is important to support the men and women who serve us in uniform. I feel very strongly about that because I myself have served in uniform for over 35 years, and I've served in a war zone and in the CIA under difficult and dangerous circumstances. But when our soldiers in Iraq did not have the proper body armor and did not have proper armor on their Humvees, what we call up-armor Humvees, I joined with Democrats of a similar opinion to work to provide those soldiers with the equipment that they needed to be safe. I didn't sacrifice my principles. The Democrats didn't sacrifice their principles. We worked together for a common objective. I think that can be done, and I think that is probably done more often than many people would like to admit.
All right. And Mr. Schiff.
Well, I think, part of this problem is you have career politicians that seem to be playing a game of one-upmanship. I mean, it seems like a lot of the stimulus bills and the jobs bills that are being proposed by the Democrats would have been supported by the Republicans had they been proposed by George Bush. I think all of these plans are misguided. I think politicians are making their votes based on polls. I think that is the problem. I think politicians are there to get elected. They say whatever they need to say to get elected, but then they do the exact opposite to stay in office. And I think we really need to change. If you want to end gridlock in a positive way, if you want to have real free market reforms, all we're doing now is repeating all the failed mistakes of the past. People say, should we have a second stimulus? It's not a second stimulus. It's a third stimulus. The first one was under George Bush. It's the same failed policy of going deep into debt to spend money. We have to change that. We have to change Washington. And the best way to do that is to send new people to Washington.
All right. Ms. McMahon.
Well, I think probably if all else failed in Washington, I would set a ring up in the Senate chamber and lay the smackdown on some of these guys that didn't want to come to the table. I have a decided advantage. You absolutely cannot give up your principles. You have to drive a bargain hard. And it is up to us as representatives, as senators or congressmen, to represent the people who sent us to Washington. What do they want? What do the citizens of Connecticut want? What are you folks telling us? Because I'm going to be listening to you to know what you want. And if you go to Washington and you've got everything in your heart and mind that's diametrically opposed to what the people in your state want, then you've got to make some compromise along the way. And I do believe that we do have to have smaller government. There's no question about we need smaller government, but I do think that term limits is the way to go, and I would not serve more than 2 terms in the United States Senate.
All right, thank you. Candidates, we have now come to the end of the Q&A part of the debate, and it's time to move on to the closing statements. By draw of cards earlier in the day, the order of closing statements will be first Ms. McMahon, second Mr. Simmons, and third Mr. Schiff. You each have 2 minutes for your closing statements, and Ms. McMahon, you may begin.
Thank you. I'd once again like to thank the hosts of this debate this evening, and for those of you who are here in the live audience, and for those of you who are at home, for your participation. I'd like to take a minute to ask a couple of questions. Have any of you ever missed a credit card payment, been late for your car payment, maybe even your mortgage payment? Have you lost your job? Do you know of someone who's lost their job? Have you ever been bankrupt? Lost your home? Lost your car? Lost your credit? Even maybe perhaps lost your business? Well, I didn't ask any of you to raise your hand, but I will. I've been there. It's not a good place to be, and I don't want you to get there. But I was able to come back and live the American dream. Last September, I announced my candidacy for the United States Senate, and since that time, I have attended over 350 meetings around the state. I'm listening to you. And I hear your frustration. I hear your concern for our economy. I hear your anger at the way that Washington is taking our country. I'm not running because I need a job. I understand what you're thinking. And I'm running for the United States Senate because I want to represent you. I don't need a hobby because the job of United States Senator is serious business. I'm running because I can no longer tolerate the lack of common sense and the lack of fiscal discipline that I see in Washington. I'm running to shake things up. I want to offer a fresh perspective. I'm not a career politician. But I have built $1 billion business out of bankruptcy, and I've created over 500 jobs here in Connecticut. I've raised my family here. And I want us to have the best representation in the Senate that we can possibly have. I want to be your senator. I want to hear what you have to say. And if you elect me to serve, it would be my honor and privilege to serve you.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Simmons.
I want to thank the University of Hartford, the Hartford Courant, and Fox 61 for hosting this event. But a special thanks goes to my wife Heidi, my daughter Jane, and my son Robert, who have supported me in my life of public service. They believe, as I do, that public office is a public trust. And there's another member of my family I'd like to mention, my grandfather, Charles Simmons, born in Brooklyn, New York, the oldest son of 7, the oldest brother of 7, the son of 2 immigrants from Ireland, who went to work at 14, joined his father at 18 to form a family business. At 38, took over the business, and before he died, owned and operated 5 small family businesses. The Simmons family did not come here for a government program, for a stimulus or a jobs bill. They came here for freedom, opportunity, and free enterprise. And that free enterprise gave them the opportunity to achieve what we call the American dream. I believe the American dream is at risk in America today because of a powerful and invasive federal government that is taxing too much, spending too much, and taking away our freedom. I didn't spend 2 tours in Vietnam fighting for freedom to lose it here at home. And I believe we have to reestablish the engine of our economy, small family businesses which create jobs and provide prosperity across the state and across the country. These are serious times. They call for serious leadership. I believe I'm the only candidate who has a comprehensive plan for prosperity. I'm certainly the only candidate who has served in war and worked for peace. The character of our Republican Party will be conveyed by the nominee that we select. I hope that my character as a public servant will reflect their choice. And I ask all of you here tonight in the audience and out there in the state of Connecticut for your support so I can continue my life of public service. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Simmons, thank you. And Mr. Schiff.
Sure. First of all, I'd like to thank my hosts, the moderator, members of the audience, and people watching at home. You know, I think our nation is at a critical point in its history. And I think I bring a unique understanding of the issues that unfortunately is missing in Washington today. In the first place, I'm an economist who actually got it right. I forecast the financial crisis of 2008 in advance. I mean, nobody sounded the alarm louder than I did. I wrote a book predicting the crisis. For 3 years, I was a fixture on financial and business television. I was on every week warning about the problems in the housing market, warning about the problems on Wall Street and in the banking sector, warning about the problems at Freddie and Fannie. And not only didn't anybody listen to me, a lot of people actually laughed at me. Number two, I'm a businessman. I'm an entrepreneur. I built my business from scratch. I started my brokerage firm in my one-bedroom apartment. I now employ more than 100 people in 6 offices. I understand where jobs come from because I've been involved in creating them. I know how businesses grow, but more importantly, I know why they don't. I know about the impediments that government places in our way. I know about the problems of bureaucratic red tape because I'm experiencing it right now firsthand in my own business. And I think, most importantly, I'm not a politician. You know, politicians, they don't care about your jobs. They only care about their own jobs. And everything they do is about perpetuating their own careers in Washington. It's about time that some of our career politicians lost their jobs. If you really want to change Washington, if you really want to shake things up, then elect me as your United States Senator. Because if you send me to Washington, I promise you one thing, that town will never be the same again.
All right, candidates, well done. Well done. And yes, now we can applaud. Well done. All right, and while we close out, just let me say that concludes our debate. We hope you found it helpful. You can find links to all the candidates' websites on cbnow.com.